so happy to be joined by Glenn Greenwald on the Jacob Ewer Show today, and I'm happy to have a co-host, Ryan Harrison, with me, who's a sophomore as well at Purdue University. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Ryan. Good to meet you guys. Thanks for having me.
Nice to meet you.
So take us through a little bit. How did you get involved? And this is very brief, but what has always stuck out to you about journalism before we dive into the questions?
Well, I didn't start my career as a journalist. I didn't go to journalism school. That wasn't my intention to be a journalist. It was actually, I went to law school and I had practiced law for about 11 years in Manhattan. And what the turning point for me was basically 9/11. I was in Manhattan on 9/11. It changed the culture, not just of the city, but of our country in ways I found pretty disturbing and in ways that I found I couldn't really have an impact on just being a lawyer. As it turned out, at the same time, right around that time, 2005, I moved to Brazil because my husband is Brazilian and we lived together. And I kind of couldn't practice law anymore from Brazil. So I needed a career change anyway. And it was the sort of thing that just gave me the push I needed. I started a blog. It took off pretty quickly for reasons having to do with some luck and some skill, I guess. And that's what led to my journalism career.
For sure. And it's just crazy to see that transformation of, being a lawyer to now going after lawyers at times, occasionally. So Ryan,
Well,
with you,
when you're a lawyer, you definitely go after lawyers as well. So it was a good practice.
no doubt about it. It made you a tough journalist now to hold people accountable. So I'll let Ryan take the first question that you kind of have.
Yeah, so I follow your show pretty closely, and I hear you talk a lot about like the Trump campaign and why they were successful in 2016. And I think the campaign really was predicated a lot on ending foreign wars and ending the neoconservative establishment in Washington, right? And you saw Don Jr. recently pledged to sort of keep neocons out of the Trump administration. And Trump's big problem in his first term, as I think you believe too, was his personnel. And although his campaign seems to have this vision of ending foreign wars, ending neoconservatism, changing the Republican dialogue, why is it that these neocons like Stefanik, Waltz, Rubio, how are they able to keep creeping into the administration?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. It's a great question. I think in his first term, he really didn't know anything about Washington. He had never worked in Washington. He had never worked in the White House, nor did the people in his immediate vicinity whom he trusted most, including his family members or business associates. And so they just got rolled so easily. We saw something very similar with President Obama. He ran on a campaign of pledging to do a whole bunch of things. And within 3 months, they had not only neutralized those, but got him to reverse them because he had been in Washington for about 4 seconds. He was a junior senator from Illinois, no match for this permanent power faction in Washington. Here we are now, 8 years later, and Trump has been through a lot, 2 impeachments, multiple prosecutions. He has a much better understanding of how the system is designed to co-opt even those people who are supposed to lead it, namely our elected officials. And people who are very close to him have told me, both on my show and otherwise, that he's very, very aware of what went wrong the first time, that he has people very close to him who are also aware of what went wrong. They're determined not to allow it again. But at the same time, as you suggested, there are a lot of choices that he made for key national security positions who might be flattering him and might be pretending, but their entire adult lives are a testament to the foreign policy ideology he says he wants to subvert. Same thing on the domestic side. He had a domestic component to his agenda, very similar, kind of overturning the bipartisan consensus about how Washington works and for whom. And you see a lot of bankers, a lot of billionaires who don't seem in any way to be anti-establishment. So the question will be, has Trump created this sufficiently coordinated climate where everyone understands their loyalty first and foremost is to him and to the campaign and pledges that he ran on? Or will they be there to run circles around him administratively and bureaucratically like they did the first time so that they can do really what he wants as long as they keep flattering him? He doesn't really notice. I think that's the big lurking question, exactly as you posed the question. I don't really know the answer to it, unfortunately.
Thanks for going into detail on that. And of course, obviously, with everything going on with Trump coming into office, you got half of the people on a college campus who were mad when he won, but there are people, like-minded people that are conservative or voted for him. Maybe not even conservative, but wanted change after 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration. So why is it so important, in your opinion, for people who are young to be open-minded and really look into sources when it comes to things relating to politics?
Well, first of all, anybody who seeks power, any factions, ruling class parties, any factions pursuing power are going to use the science of propaganda to try and deceive you and misguide you and mislead you into believing they're doing things in your interest when in fact they're not doing things in your interest at all. And it's not a question of being smart. Propaganda is constructed as a science designed to trigger our inborn psychological impulses. And if you don't have the willingness or the ability, and often just the time to sit down and critically evaluate the things you're absorbing, you're often going to end up believing a bunch of things that aren't true. I mean, that happened to me when, as I said, I transitioned from law to journalism, and I suddenly had the time to read original source documentation. I didn't have to have events mediated for me. I had my own sources, my own ability to watch things. I realized that a lot of the things I had come to believe, just consuming the New York Times or the Atlantic or the New Yorker, were things that were completely baseless and false, often the opposite of the truth. So I don't think any of us want to be deceived. And so if you're young, I think it's very important to consciously work on critical thinking, make sure you're not ingesting things simply because people near you are all repeating them. And then also, how you end up thinking determines what your actions are. Beliefs precede actions. And so if you allow your beliefs to be manipulated by other people for you, you're going to end up doing things not as a byproduct of your own autonomy, but because other people have tricked you and deceived you into doing them. I don't think anyone wants their lives to be shaped by those kinds of external forces either.
Very good point. So thank you for sharing that. And that really wasn't a Republican or Democratic answer. That was just an answer of, be careful where you get your sources from and don't believe everything you see on CNN or Fox, be well-rounded. So thank you for sharing that. Ryan, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, I just had one more question. I feel like you're very well versed. You followed sort of the political landscape throughout the last 20 years, and especially with what's going on now. As soon as there was a ceasefire in southern Lebanon, you saw the U.S.-backed rebels in Syria overthrow the Assad government, and you see Israel beginning to annex the Golan Heights now. Do you think that Trump, with all of his donors, and all of the Zionists who have been backing his campaign, will be able to keep us out of a direct war in the Middle East, especially with respect to Iran?
Here's the problem is that Trump had two roads in front of him. Either he was going to win the 2024 election and become president again, or they were going to imprison him. He was already convicted in the New York case, had sentencing pending, had major felony charges facing him in 3 other jurisdictions, at least 2 of which were quite serious. These ones Jack Smith brought in Washington and South Florida. And so I think he got quite desperate and started thinking, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make sure I win. Unlike in 2016, where he was very carefree, barely cared if he was going to win, didn't even seem to want to win that badly sometimes, was fine with just kind of using the platform. I felt like in 2024, he was eager to win. The hardest core Zionists, the people who want U.S. foreign policy to be geared principally toward Israeli interests, originally wanted DeSantis. That was their candidate. If you look at who the hardcore neocons are in the Republican Party, the hardcore Zionists, they almost all were aligned behind him. And once it became evident that he had no chance, that Trump was still completely dominant in the party, they started, sort of the wheels started churning about how they were going to ensure Trump stayed under control and they could commandeer the Trump movement to make it like the DeSantis campaign or Marco Rubio or John McCain. And one of the ways that they succeeded was by getting Mary Matelson to become one of Trump's top funders. She was already that, she and Sheldon Adelson. But when you give somebody more than $100 million, you're going to do, or at least listen very carefully to what they want. And then one of the things that happened was he got surrounded by almost everyone who's near him who believes the same thing about Israel. There's almost no dissent. For all the heterodoxy in his choices, the one thing they all have in common, I'm talking about Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Hegseth, all of them, is that they all are on board the Israel train. And I can't imagine who in Trump's orbit is going to be the one who pushes a little bit. Maybe JD Vance will, although I think his influence is going to be limited, but I think he has that capacity. Or maybe just Trump will. Trump is often driven by personal vengeance. He doesn't really like Netanyahu all that much.
Yeah.
I've seen some expressions of criticism toward Netanyahu that are clearly personal for Trump. And I think he also likes the image of feeling like he ends wars. If that's something that he's capable of doing, it's kind of a reflection of power to be able to do that. But on the other hand, there's a lot of really powerful forces embedded within Trump camp that he's dependent on to win. And I'm not particularly optimistic about him overcoming those.
Appreciate you elaborating on that. And then kind of my last question that I have is, you've already talked a lot about Russia and Ukraine, so I don't want to ask you about that because you've talked so much about that. So I want to kind of ask you a newer topic. Is obviously Trump's been poking around, kind of being funny like he does about Canada, Governor Justin Trudeau, the 51st state, all that stuff, which people can take that in several different directions. But do you kind of see, where do you kind of see Canada and Mexico and America this next time around? Obviously, the USMCA had been passed under his first administration, but where do you kind of just see us going with, our North American partners at in a way, from your point of view?
I mean, the fundamental reality is that the United States is still the most powerful country on earth economically and militarily. And so if you're a neighboring country of the United States, meaning Mexico and Canada, that's just a reality of life that you have to deal with. It is not an equal bilateral relationship. It is a relationship where one country has far more power and influence than the other. Typically, both with Canada, but especially with Canada, but even so with Mexico, the idea has been that we treat them as neighbors. We don't really have a lot of conflict with either of them. But I think Trump looks north and south and sees, I wouldn't say enemies, but countries that he feels are unfairly exploiting the United States. And unlike other countries, unlike prior presidents who have seemed to prioritize other threats, Trump views economic threats to the welfare of the United States as being his priority. And he sees both Canada and Mexico in that way. And that's why he's talking about Justin Trudeau and the whole Mexican government in this quite dismissive manner, because he's saying we're basically subsidizing you. And so either we're going to treat you that way, like a vassal colony or a state even, like subordinate to us, or we're going to end this. And it's so rare to hear a president talk about Canada and even Mexico in those ways that I'm sure it's falling very harshly in those capitals.
For sure, no doubt about it. I think that's a very valid claim, And then kind of one last question I wanted to end with is, what is the most rewarding part of your job? And Ryan, do you have anything else to add to that?
I don't think so. But yeah, I was just adding on like sort of what kind of like motivates you to keep pursuing the truth. And I feel like you've been someone who speaks truth to power, you've kept the same morals while the political paradigm has shifted radically. So yeah, what keeps you going?
Yeah, I think what I always tried to do is just make sure that whatever I was doing, I was passionate about it. I felt passionate about it. It seems like a luxury. And maybe at some points it is. Sometimes early in your career, you have to sacrifice a little to get to where you want to go. It doesn't mean you can just start doing what you love immediately. When I got out of law school, for example, I went and I worked for this gigantic Wall Street law firm. And it was representing Goldman Sachs and insurance companies and banks, exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. And I stayed there about 18 months just to gather up the instruments and weapons. And it opened doors for me and then let me go and do the things I wanted to do more. And I think what happens is if you go to college and then you go to graduate school, most people who do that have some kind of passion about something that they're pursuing. And these institutions are designed to extinguish your passion, to just kind of mold you into this homogenous way of doing whatever industry you're preparing to enter, and to kill that passion, to extinguish it. And I think it's so important to maintain it. So for me, as I said, I started this career in journalism purely out of desire to make my voice heard more about issues that I thought weren't getting enough attention, especially the war on civil liberties being conducted in the name of combating terrorism after 9/11. That was the thing I had always wanted to write about and think about and talk about. It's why I became a constitutional lawyer. So it never was a job for me, and it still isn't really. It's still something that just I wake up and I see these things I think need to be batted around or attacked or kicked around, and that's what I get to do. And there's a lot of energy behind it. And as long as you're doing something that you really believe in, that's how you avoid the dreariness of year after year feeling like you're just working in drudgery, which I promise you there's no money in the world, no prestige in the world that can compensate for that if you have that. So that's always my advice to anybody, especially younger people who are starting off, is just to make sure you maintain that passion, you stay connected to it. And even if you have to put it aside for a little while for some short-term compromise, make sure it's not permanent.
Appreciate it. Well, Glenn, thank you so much for coming on the show today, and we appreciate everything that you do with what you do in your career currently.
Yeah, I
So
have to
thank you.
say, I first heard about you in the Snowden movie a long time ago, and I think your career has been really inspiring to me. So I appreciate the time.
Thank you. I'll send Zach Quinto thank you for having sent me somebody, a new reader. But yeah, I appreciate you guys. Always enjoy talking to people who are young and interested in these sorts of things. So thanks for having me.